Welcome to today's video. This video is a bit more of a research-intensive dress history video focusing on the paper pattern industry. If you enjoy dress history videos, specifically 20th century dress history videos, go ahead and give this video a like and subscribe. Now let's get on to the video. Paper patterns are an invaluable resource for dress historians because they model what people were actually wearing as opposed to museum pieces, which are generally formal wear, a little bit too nice to have worn on a daily basis, so they were preserved and thus are able to be shown in museum exhibits today. Patterns also display the garment construction practices of the time. Since the tissue paper used in patterns is acid-free, century-old patterns have been preserved remarkably well. Pattern companies remained fashionable and kept up with the times, so they are actually a good gauge for what women were wearing. As homemakers acquired sewing machines, the paper pattern industry was there to meet all of their dressmaking needs. A 1916 advertisement once said, "There is nothing so cheap, yet so valuable, so common, yet so realized, so unappreciated, yet so beneficial as the paper pattern." Paper patterns can also be credited with the democratization of women's fashion in the 20th century. The first pattern was published by Juan de Halcega in 1580. His book, Practice of Tailoring, Measuring, and Marking Out, was to instruct tailors on how to cut out garments in the most economical way possible. And obviously this makes sense since fabric in the 16th century was wildly expensive. The Tailor's Complete Guide by the Society of Adepts is the oldest known cutting book in English. Before there was an organized way to cut out clothing, the rock eye method was used. The rock eye system used freehand pattern drawing by eye. Patterns would be passed down from father to son, like gold, lace, or other valuables. Tailors even referred to their patterns or pattern drafting systems as gods and kept their patterns incredibly secretive. By the end of the 18th century, tailors were teaching their pattern drafting systems to anybody who could afford it. Country tailors would journey to London in order to buy patterns, which would cost them about $650 in today's money. Before the inch was implemented, measuring was made up of using strips of notched parchment proportional to the particular customer's measurements. In the mid-19th century, periodicals were offering full-sized patterns in addition to pattern drafts. Ebenezer Butterick, a Massachusetts tailor, began with offering 10 free patterns with each of his periodicals. For women in the 18th century, finding the latest fashions occurred through either word of mouth, fashion dolls known as Pandoras, fashion plates, or publications for professional dressmakers. Clothing production at this time was the prerogative of male tailors and female dressmakers or mantua makers. The first patterns for homemakers appeared in The Lady's Economical Assistant, published in 1808, and contained 27 patterns. However, these patterns were for only basic garments and were only offered in one size. These early pattern publications assumed that once a pattern was cut out, a savvy homemaker would just know how to sew it together. So no instructions of any kind were included in these periodicals. By the 1830s, waves of garment-related books that contained patterns for women's clothing came to market. The Workwoman's Guide in 1838 began to include instructions and offered more fashionable items of clothing like stylish stays, shirts, slippers, caps, and bonnets. Now these were not exactly full-sized patterns. They needed to be scaled up, like in Patterns of Fashion by Janet Arnold. It is possible that full-sized patterns were available by 1836, however none are known to have survived. By the 1850s, periodicals began offering full-sized patterns across America and Europe. Individuals such as Madame Follett in England and Madame Demarest in America offered proportionally scaled patterns. These patterns, however, only included basic pieces, no plackets, pockets, or facings. Although this was a vast improvement from the early part of the 19th century, patterns available in the 1850s left much to be desired. As the 19th century progressed, new technology came onto the scene, such as the sewing machine and portable dress form. This made dressmaking for home sewers much easier. The Industrial Revolution introduced the steam-driven paper-making machine, which produced paper from wood pulp at a fraction of the cost of rag or cloth pulp paper. As the literacy rate increased, along with new technology in printing, the paper pattern industry really took off. Now, the paper pattern industry would be nothing without the home sewing machine. Singer perfected the sewing machine by 1851, and by 1856, a portable machine was designed for home use. Tailors were initially skeptical that a sewing machine could create high-quality garments and were slow to adopt it. However, women were quick to get their hands on this time-saving innovation. There was actually concern that the sewing machine would have a negative effect on women. Many men wanted to believe that women could not handle such a complicated piece of machinery. They feared that if women did complete their sewing duties in less time, they would have more time to maybe get involved in the suffrage movement or, God forbid, improve themselves. Dressmakers began to earn considerably more with the sewing machine. However, one thing that stood in the way of home sewing was the lack of consistent and reliable patterns, especially in rural communities. Thankfully, around this time, the U.S. Postal Service expanded from only accepting personal letters before 1845 to accepting more printed materials like patterns, periodicals, and catalogs. Also, the sewing machine meant more complicated garments could be constructed in less time. By the end of the 1860s, women's dress changed from rectangular shapes with fitted darts gathered at the waist to more complex and shapely pieces seamed together to conform to the upper body. Skirts changed to use gores instead of simple rectangles, and as the dissemination of information became much faster with the U.S. Postal Service, fashion began changing at an accelerated rate. Demarest was the first pattern paper company to mass produce patterns for the home sewer in the United States. Although pattern designers at this time were seldomly acknowledged, most patterns always claimed some sort of connection to Paris. Simple patterns would cost about 25 cents, and patterns with trim and all the bells and whistles would cost about 50 cents. Demarest began offering pattern sizes in 1871. Each pattern had a large illustration printed on the face, minimal instructions, suggestions for fabric, fabric type, yardage, trim, and yeah, I think that's it. These first patterns were actually identified with a name rather than a number like we kind of know today. Ebenezer Butterick entered the market in 1863. Most of his patterns were actually for separates, like a bodice or a skirt or like sleeves or a collar. However, his patterns were available in 10 different sizes based on the bust measurement and ranged from 28 inches to 46 inches. Now, off-the-rack clothing was available at this time. However, the close-fitting bodices of the 19th century did not lend itself well to the inconsistent sizing of ready-to-wear garments. That is why women still made their clothing at home or went to a dressmaker. By the 1870s, the paper pattern production had been refined to allow for mass production. Sending out periodicals and catalogs were the way that the pattern companies advertised. The success of Demarest and Butterick inspired others to join the pattern industry. For example, James McCall immigrated from Scotland to New York in 1869 and started McCall's, which is still in business today. The pattern industry also expanded employment opportunities to women. Women were employed to consult on patterns, package patterns, design patterns, and even sell patterns. Traditions of everyday life changed dramatically during the First World War. A patriotic spirit prompted the pattern companies to work together to save on materials like paper. Since paper was to be conserved, the number of patterns printed and sold decreased during this time. Pattern companies began offering patterns for dresses that were made with only 2 yards of 54-inch wide fabric. Pattern companies also provided patterns for uniforms and special work clothes approved by the government. Even the Red Cross lent their logo to the pattern companies in order to produce hospital uniforms in their name. Pants were even acceptable given the new role that women took during the war. However, they were only acceptable on the factory floor and not in like everyday life generally. During the first 2 decades of the 20th century, patterns were generally cut and punched with little perforations to mark out where to cut and notches and darts, etc. And by 1910, the instructions included in patterns began to become much more detailed so that novice home sewers could really follow along as well. Companies also began to take advantage of both the front and back of the envelopes and printed a few small diagrams along with a cutting layout for the pattern pieces. With the increase in women's education and home economics programs in women's colleges in the 20th century, it was no longer a mother or a grandmother's job to teach the next generation how to sew, like in the 19th century. The pattern companies also published sewing manuals like Butterick's Dressmaker and Sewing Made Easy by McCall's, which were made for women who couldn't really attend home ec classes, who maybe couldn't afford them or lived in rural areas. In the 1920s, more and more women gained employment, so their time to create their own clothing dwindled. The ready-to-wear garment industry was offering well-made garments at reasonable prices. And since the 1920s silhouette was somewhat boxy and straight, ready-to-wear options were a practical fit. Many homes in metropolitan areas gained electricity around this time. Appliances like the iron and washing machine reduced housework and gave homemakers more time. So during this time, McCall's was much more innovative than its counterparts. McCall's developed printed patterns instead of cut and punch patterns, which they then promptly patented and enjoyed an expanded market share in the process. Printed patterns are definitely much more easy to work with. It's just easier to visualize and see where everything will go. McCall's also added colored images on their envelopes, which really made them stand out from the rest. They also licensed patterns from famous Parisian couturiers. Another large pattern company that is still in business today is Simplicity. Simplicity was founded in December of 1927. It became one of the most successful pattern companies given their affordable and easy to follow patterns. So there's a misconception that the pattern industry did well during the Great Depression because more women were at home sewing, making their own clothes. While it is definitely true that women were making more of their own clothing, they were also buying less patterns. Like most businesses, when the economy is down, business suffers, no matter what you are. People save money even on the essentials. Although a few 10 and 15 cent patterns were available in 1930, most patterns cost around 25 to 50 cents, and Vogue patterns ranged anywhere from 50 cents to $1, which is about $20 today. At this time, when a loaf of bread cost only 5 cents, a $1 pattern was a serious investment. However, unlike a loaf of bread, a pattern could be shared and copied as many times as possible. In order to get around buying new clothing, women began freshening up their existing dresses by changing the sleeves, adding a new collar, changing the cuffs, etc. And pattern companies responded to this trend by releasing patterns for only sleeves or new collars or cuffs or hats, etc. This was much less expensive than buying a whole new dress or even a whole new wardrobe. Despite the economic woes of the Great Depression, 3 new pattern companies were created during this time: Advance, Dewberry, and Hollywood Patterns. Vogue, which was very expensive for the time, decided to create an affordable pattern line modeled after the clothing of Hollywood actors. And in 1933, Hollywood Patterns was in chain stores like W.T. Grant and J.J. Newberry. Advance was affiliated with JCPenney and specifically priced for JCPenney at only 5 cents a pattern. Advance patterns were cut and punched, like the rest of them, and offered minimal instructions. I have a few advanced patterns myself, and they are by far the most difficult patterns to work with. The instructions are just terrible. If you ever tried to follow an advanced pattern, you definitely know the struggle. In the early 30s, popular department store Woolworths wanted to create their own in-house pattern line to sell in their 5 and dime stores, so Simplicity created Dewberry in 1932. This was a savvy move for Simplicity since Woolworths was a multinational high-volume chain, and this guaranteed them business. So during this time, pattern companies all had a singular goal of making sure young people knew how to sew. So they provided, mostly Simplicity and McCall's, would provide sewing patterns to use in home ec programs for novice students in schools. As the Second World War began, the economy in North America, as well as in South America, began to rebound since Europe needed massive amounts of supplies and material to fund their war effort. As the United States began to increase their involvement in World War II from about 1941 to 1946, the United States imposed price controls on goods in order to mitigate inflation. Most pattern companies established top prices that were high enough to carry them through the war years. With Germany's occupation of France, the American market was cut off from the latest Parisian designs. It was feared that the fashion market in the United States would tank. However, pattern companies turned to American designers and found that their designs sold just as well. During World War II, the US government issued Regulation L85, which regulated textile and clothing manufacturing. Textile manufacturers attempted to increase their profits during this time by decreasing the quality of fabric. The regulations and rationing of the war years really defined the 1940s silhouette. The use of certain fibers were banned or limited, and skirts, collars, and sleeves had to adhere to strict measurements. Embellishments like knife pleats, patch pockets, and excessive ruffles were banned altogether. Pattern companies responded patriotically to World War II, just like they did in World War I, and released many patterns that used 3 yards of fabric or less. They also permitted the use of scraps from leftover garments to make new garments. The restrictions led to programs such as Make and Mend in the United States and Make, Do, and Mend in the UK. This encouraged homemakers to give garments new life through mending. Like in World War I, pattern companies issued patterns of service uniforms, practical dresses, and nursing uniforms in conjunction with the Red Cross. Since women were recruited for factory work to replace absent men, they needed appropriate clothing. Well-known designer at the time, Vera Maxwell, was commissioned to design a jumpsuit for the female factory worker as depicted in the famous Rosie the Riveter We Can Do It poster. Simplicity's pattern 4104 and Advanced pattern 2913 is very similar to Maxwell's design. Although pants were still considered unfeminine, necessity began to change their acceptability for women during and after the war. The patriotic spirit within the United States States during this time definitely reflected on the patterns. Two notable examples are McCall's 1943 Victory apron and Simplicity's V for Victory dress, published in 1942. Vogue did a few makeover patterns, including one for a woman's jacket and skirt made from a man's old suit. Just like during the Great Depression, patterns for collars, sleeves, and cuffs were readily available to refresh clothing instead of having to go out and buy a whole new garment. The rise of the teenager as a separate category created a separate market in the 1940s. The concept of the teen market began with Butterick's younger-looking fashions and junior miss patterns in the 1930s. With inflation affecting all areas of the economy, home sewing was an effective cost-saving activity which extended into peacetime. Many homemakers found their creations to be better fitting and better quality than ready-to-wear options available at the time. In the 1950s, 5 companies dominated the market: Advance, Butterick, McCall's, Simplicity, and Vogue. The Great Depression and the war years witnessed the end of the pattern company monthly fashion magazine publications, with the exception of McCall's, who produced their magazine up until 1975. Since regulations were lifted in the later years of the 1940s, more fabric could be used in clothing. This was perfect for Dior's New Look, which was produced in 1947 but became massively popular in the 1950s. Women craved luxury after the war, so the large bust, small waist, full skirt, and T-length dresses of the New Look became wildly popular. It was a hit all over North America, Europe, and South America, in places like Argentina, where Eva Perón was a fashion icon, and I'm definitely going to do a separate video on her because she is just amazing. The change in the silhouette was so rapid that it was difficult for the pattern industry to keep up. Since these styles were now comprised of narrower shoulders, a longer hem, and a fuller skirt, some pattern companies adjusted already existing patterns by lengthening the hem and removing the shoulder pads. American style emerged as a major influence in the 1950s, specifically in the arena of sportswear and casual wear. Youthful and teenage looks were becoming ever more prominent in the 1950s. The introduction of casual wear impacted the international community and led to the acceptance of women wearing pants outside of the factory. McCall's patent on printed patterns expired in 1950, so the other pattern giants began to switch to printed patterns as well. Parisian and designer-named patterns persisted, and Vogue led the way with their Paris Original line. Woven cloth labels were included in the Paris Original line, and they really enhanced the feel of a homemade garment. Simplicity quickly followed Vogue's approach with their own designer line, which had a top price of 50 cents as compared to Vogue's $2 price. Advance Patterns established a partnership with the New York Times for Designs of the Times, which was an American designer series featuring up-and-coming designers. After the war ended, women were unfortunately sold on the importance of returning back to the home and retaking their role as homemaker. Images of the ideal family proliferated in the media in programs such as Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver. Pattern designs for aprons epitomized the push to revert women to the role of homemaker once again. This placed emphasis on leisured middle-class pursuits such as cocktail parties, luncheons, and ice cream socials. The feminine role of Rosie the Riveter changed to the happy housewife. However, by the end of the 1950s, the idealized suburban lifestyle promoted throughout the decade began to crumble. New energies, influences, and technology initiated restructuring and revised the focus of the pattern industry. The 1960s were a boom period for pattern companies, despite the growing availability of ready-to-wear garments at affordable prices. In the 1960s, Simplicity began printing their patterns in English, Swedish, Dutch, Japanese, and even built a new factory in Hatogayo, Japan in 1961. Butterick began selling their patterns in major grocery stores such as A&P, Stop & Shop, and Safeway. By the mid-1960s, only 4 major pattern companies dominated the market: Butterick and Vogue, who merged together, McCall's, and Simplicity. Advance stopped producing their patterns in 1965. Also, a new niche market of pattern companies emerged, such as quick sew and folkwear. Given that sizing between ready-to-wear vanity sizing and pattern sizing were different, the pattern companies aimed to standardize sizing to match the ready-to-wear clothing. So they changed their size 14, which was previously a 34-inch bust, to a 36-inch bust. Another innovation made was combining multiple sizes into one pattern. This allowed sewists to mix and match different sizes. In 1978, the metric system became standard, so pattern manufacturers in the United States, as well as those based in the UK, began including inches and yards as well as centimeters and meters. Values began to change in the 1960s. Youth was now prioritized in fashion. The new generation wanted to rebel against the conformity of the 1950s, so new fashions expressed bold statements, new freedoms, and ethnic influences, with bright and bold coloring and patterns. Strides made in textile science in the 1950s resulted in new synthetics on the consumer market in the 1960s, such as spandex and higher quality polyester fabric. These new fabrics were wrinkle-free, stretchy, and easy to work with. The hemline in the mid to late 1960s arrived at the lower to mid-thigh thanks to the miniskirt created by Mary Quant in 1965. The miniskirt and the new boxy silhouette was not dissimilar to the impact that Dior's new look had on the previous decade. Promoting options for individuality is why the pattern companies did so well in the 1960s. These patterns offered 4 different lengths, maybe a blouse, a jacket, and pants, so you really got a lot out of one pattern in the 1960s. As marketing budgets expanded, celebrities from film and TV were hired for promotion. Butterick and McCall's hired Marie Osmond and Marlo Thomas to promote their patterns. The companies also actively recruited African-American designers like Willie Smith, who designed for Butterick and McCall's. As the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s arrives, the American consumer entered an age of conspicuous consumption. There were 6 identifiable influences like the dress for success movement, the preppy movement, which took from 1950s styles, the ragtag look, romanticism, which took from the 1930s and 40s, historicism, and the physical fitness initiative. Dress for success books became Bibles for young career-oriented professionals and was defined as work-appropriate attire with clean lines. The power suit for women gained mass popularity. The power suit was characterized by padded shoulders and wide lapels. Romanticism was influenced by Charles and Diana's union in 1981 and took influences from the puffy sleeves of the 1930s and the shoulder pads of the 1940s. In the 1990s, historicism was fueled by nostalgia, so companies like Vogue, Butterick, and Simplicity began to re-release patterns from the 1930s, 40s, and 50s according to 90s sizing. As reenacting as a hobby grew, so did the need for historically inspired garments, and simplicity dominated the historical arena. Fitness and casual styles became wildly popular during the 90s and 80s. Sweatshirts, leg warmers, sweatpants, and sneakers became very popular among youth particularly, and are still incredibly popular today. So the 1980s was defined by the birth of accessible computerized technology. The pattern industry used computerized programs to trim costs, to improve inventory control, and to boost productivity. This new investment in capital meant that labor was heavily reduced, so a lot of people ended up losing their jobs. Personal computers, printers, and software also meant that regular people could design new patterns and print them out at home. The sewing machine also became computerized during this time, and sergers or overlock machines became popular. The pattern industry responded to this and pivoted by offering new patterns specifically designed with sergers in mind. However, no matter what the pattern companies did, they hit an all-time low in the 1980s. People just were not sewing like they used to. With women opting out of homemaking and joining the workforce, home sewing goods such as fabric, notion, and pattern sales slumped. Sadly, many fabric stores were forced to close in the 1980s and 90s, and the few that are left continue to struggle to this day. Due to fast fashion's extremely low prices, it's almost impossible for them to compete. Due to the growing interest in crafting, the pattern industry placed a greater emphasis on quilting, Halloween costumes, and historical reconstructions. Pattern companies began to establish affiliations with large fabric companies such as Joann's, which emphasized creative hobbies for working women. McCall's in particular experienced difficulty in the 1980s. It was bought and sold twice in 1983 and 1987, and then in 1988 it had to file for bankruptcy. McCall's eventually emerged out of the bankruptcy and concentrated on the changing needs of their customer base. In 1988, some companies phased out the practice of containing multiple sizes in one pattern. Multi-sized patterns required more basic shapes, which limited design features, whereas single-sized patterns could produce a more intricate garment. During this time, Simplicity's sales fell from $112 million a year to $65 million a year. However, their patterns were still popular. The Mooney mass wedding in 1982 in New York's Madison Square Garden resulted in 2,075 couples using the Simplicity wedding dress pattern 8392. They also engaged in influencer marketing by partnering with Christie Brinkley. And for their craft patterns, they acquired a license with Disney to make stuffed toys and costumes. Currently, the pattern industry is struggling more than ever. Sewing is no longer done for necessity, but for pleasure. Anecdotally speaking, I don't know anybody in my personal life who sews or even thinks of sewing. Being young and sewing nowadays is almost like a novelty. Fast fashion brands dominated whatever little market share pattern companies had left in the 90s and 2000s. In the 2000s, pattern companies continued to downsize. McCall's acquired Butterick and Vogue in 2001. They've designated Butterick as classical, McCall's as contemporary, and Vogue as couture. It is also difficult for pattern companies to keep up with the extremely fast-paced trends of our current fashion climate. However, it is important and hopeful to note that there are a handful of independent pattern companies who do capture a small market share and are very successful in their own right. So at least there's that. I hope this video was interesting. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. I really, really appreciate it. And join me next week for my notebook reconstruction. Have a great week otherwise. Bye.